So speaking about the best and the brightest, Toshi Yoshihara is our first speaker today. Toshi is the senior fellow at the Center of Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. He was previously the inaugural John A. Van Buren Chair for Asia Pacific Studies here at the War College. And he was a member of the Strategy and Policy faculty, and his lectures were terrific when he was a faculty member here, and we are certainly looking forward to for him today. He's the co-author of the Red Star over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to the U.S. Maritime Strategy, and that was co-authored with Jim Holmes, who you heard from yesterday. And then his most recent book, Mao's Army Goes to Sea, The Island Campaigns and the Founding of the Chinese Navy. So, Toshi, welcome back to the Spruance Auditorium.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, to be back at the Naval War College in beautiful Newport. Whenever I'm in Spruance, I'm reminded of my days in the Strategy and Policy Department, stomping around on this stage, talking about Mao Zedong and Chinese maritime strategy. So thank you for having me back. Today, I'd like to talk about an article that I co-wrote with my colleague at CSBA entitled Conquering Taiwan by Other Means through the Washington Quarterly Journal. The argument that we make in the article is that in recent years, China has amassed an array of coercive tools that might enable China to bring Taiwan to its knees without having to go down the full-scale invasion route. Now, why is this particular argument important? Well, in our view, folks inside the Beltway, folks in the Pentagon, have been quite focused on the invasion scenario, and for good reason, and I'll explain why it's important for us to focus on the invasion scenario. However, because China has all of these coercive tools that it could employ, a narrow focus on an invasion scenario might lead us to neglect other possibilities. And so that if a crisis were to hit over Taiwan and China does something that's potentially radically different from our expectations, that we might be caught out of balance, out of position, and potentially out of options. So this is simply a plea for us to consider other alternative scenarios that might involve a contingency. Now, I think it's important to note, the key caveat here is we're not saying that the invasion scenario is somehow not important, that we need to ignore it, that we need to downplay it. The Taiwan scenario is, in fact, very important. So it's not an either-or proposition that we're making. It's not, coercion or invasion. I think the problem is it's coercion and invasion that makes this such a difficult dilemma for us. The point here is to say that China will now, going forward, pose multiple types of challenges, and the onus is on the United States and its allies to be able to respond to a wider array of contingencies to include invasion. Okay, so in our mind's eye, when we think about the Taiwan contingency, we typically have this in our minds, right? Which is an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait. The PLA would form lodgements, secure the beachheads, and then the land forces would push inland to take the major cities, to take the rest of Taiwan. Now, there is good reason for us to be focused on this scenario, right? What we call the pacing scenario by the pacing threat. Of course, firstly, it's potentially one of the most consequential scenarios that one can envision. It would be a major regional war that, if it drew in the United States, would be a regional war involving great powers, and in my view, potentially a globalized war between China and the United States. This is very serious. Of course, if you think about all the war games that's been playing out in Washington, we also anticipate that the United States, if it were to be drawn into a Taiwan contingency, this could potentially be quite costly, right? Including the loss of several carriers, potentially. And of course, just think the whole idea of having to project power across the Pacific to reinforce forces operating along the first island chain into the teeth of Chinese anti-access area denial capabilities is just a very difficult problem set to even consider and to plan. And I think implicit in the assumptions of those focused on the Taiwan scenario, the Taiwan invasion scenario, is that a powerful counter-invasion force would be able to handle all of the lesser included scenarios. Our question is, what if China does something potentially radically differently, right? If it pursues alternative courses of action beyond sort of the way that we're thinking about the scenario, and that we might not be prepared for that type of a scenario. So it's a plea for us to consider other possibilities. I think it's also important to note that we need to think about this from Xi Jinping's perspective, right? So Xi Jinping understands, and his subordinates understand, that any contested amphibious operation would be highly complex, difficult, risky, and in the case of a Taiwan scenario, it could potentially lead to horizontal escalation, meaning it would draw in the United States and its allies. And I think there's a growing consensus now in Washington that a war involving China and the United States would lead to a bloody, protracted conflict, even if both sides were trying to achieve a quick, decisive victory. I think it's also important to note that Xi Jinping has to balance a range of long-term goals under the rubric of the China Dream, or the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is a long-term plan to have China vault to the front ranks of the greatest powers on earth by mid-century. And of course, one of the key goals is reunion with Taiwan by force or by peaceful means. But that particular goal is actually in tension with Xi's other goals, like making sure that China emerges as the most advanced economy in the world. If China finds itself in a protracted war, that economic goal could be significantly set back. Xi Jinping also has aims to create a world-class military by mid-century. Well, if that military is caught in a protracted war and is significantly downgraded, that goal of a world-class military could also be set back. And if the Taiwanese were to resist, the PLA faces the prospect of a potentially bloody pacification campaign on the island. And so in our view, it's probably worth hypothesizing, speculating about what alternative theories of victory Xi Jinping and his subordinates might be considering. And we think that there may be other options that gets more directly at breaking the enemy's will versus breaking the enemy's capability, which is what an invasion would require, right? An invasion scenario would require the PLA to destroy the enemy's means to resist in order to conquer Taiwan. And our speculation is, are there ways where the CCP could actually get at the Taiwan question more towards hitting against the adversary's will to resist? So I'm going to offer three illustrative options, and I think there are probably more than these three options, but these three illustrative options gives us a chance to examine some of the mechanics and the intended effects of these coercive options short of a full-scale invasion. The first option is something that folks in Washington have started to consider, which is a blockade or a quarantine against Taiwan. And for the purposes of my talk today, I want to focus in particular on the quarantine option, because I think it reveals some of the effects that CCP might seek to achieve against both Taiwan, the United States, and its allies. So in terms of a quarantine, it benefits from the element of tactical and operational surprise if a quarantine were spun off from, say, an ongoing military exercise. So using an exercise as a cover to conduct a quarantine. A quarantine also benefits from some degree of ambiguity in the sense that the CCP would likely employ paramilitary, non-military instruments rather than, say, naval vessels, so the use of the Coast Guard and the Maritime militia, making it difficult to discern exactly what's going on. China could also employ a customs inspection regime, a regulatory regime that would seek to reroute shipping headed for Taiwan to mainland ports for security inspection. And China could potentially muddy the diplomatic waters by describing all of this as a domestic law enforcement action. The effects of this, of course, would be to deprive goods and services that the Taiwanese need to survive. And of course, it would also deepen the Taiwanese sense of isolation. But I think one of the most important effects of a quarantine is actually to place the onus of counter-escalation, the onus of a response on the United States and on its allies. And I think one of the complicating factors here would be if it's enough ambiguity, it might throw sand in the gears of decision making in terms of, first of all, discerning exactly what's going on, and then making a political decision to respond. And I think this potentially could be particularly problematic for, say, some of our allies like Japan, where there is no clear armed aggression or armed attack that could trigger a whole series of political decisions that would allow Japan to respond effectively and quickly alongside the United States. What's the evidence for this? Well, the Chinese have been engaging in a series of large-scale military and paramilitary exercises in recent years. This one is from October of 2024 that involved 4 Coast Guard flotillas off the coast of Taiwan engaged in a mock quarantine. The second option that I'd like to discuss briefly, sorry, this is the best that I can do with the AI, is subversion and sabotage, all right? So what do I mean by subversion and sabotage? Well, subversion and sabotage by CCP agents in Taiwan. So subversion could involve the use of covert agents, saboteurs, and compromised insiders. And we know that, in fact, this has been going on by the CCP inside of Taiwan. And that when activated, these agents would be used to bribe, intimidate, blackmail, and even assassinate and kill key political and military leaders on Taiwan. The purpose of doing so is to divide the politicians from the military commanders, potentially to pit the 2 main political parties against each other, and in the worst case scenario, and there's in fact a historical basis for this, which I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A, which is having operational commanders in Taiwan actually stand down and not fight, and to pledge their fealty to the mainland. This would have the effect of what we call the reverse Zelensky effect. So if you look at the picture on the right, that was a memorable moment, wasn't it? When Zelensky said, we're going to stay in Kyiv, we're not going anywhere, we're going to fight. And that had a powerful galvanizing impact on the international community, right, to support Ukraine. Well, the reverse effect would go something like this. Imagine debates happening in the White House where people are saying, hey, if the Taiwanese seem like they're not willing to fight, why should we risk our blood and treasure? And that, I think, in turn, could, again, throw sand in the gears of decision-making about exactly or whether the United States and its allies should intervene and respond. What's the evidence for this? Well, not a month goes by without hearing some disturbing news out of Taiwan about former military officers, even active duty military officers, civilians, and so forth, taking money from Chinese intelligence agencies to conduct espionage and other harmful activities. So the case I want to highlight to you took place earlier this year, where 7 co-conspirators were indicted in a conspiracy that was funded by the Chinese intelligence agency. And the plan was to create assassination squads and fifth column forces behind enemy lines so that when Taiwan was attacked from the front by the PLA, these forces would be activated to conduct disruption operations. Now, what the leading co-conspirator, a former Taiwanese military officer, was in fact a founder of a small political party in Taiwan. So this is happening as we speak. The third option, it's an option that we don't typically think about, is early nuclear signaling by China against the United States and its key allies. So this isn't about, limited warfighting or the actual employment of nuclear forces. It's about playing a political psychological game to drive wedges between the United States and its key allies. And it's called decoupling. So I'm just going to kind of walk through how this works in terms of the logic of decoupling. China now increasingly has a diverse, theater-range, nuclear-capable arsenal that really only has the ranges to hit key targets within the region and would spare the American homeland. This arsenal might enable Beijing to make tailored threats against U.S. allies, clearly without being able to threaten the American homeland. This might trigger fears among U.S. allies that the United States would be disinclined to risk a nuclear confrontation in their defense. So CCP would be asking a key question, right, which is, would the United States actually trade Los Angeles for Tokyo? If our allies' answer to this question is no, that could significantly undermine their confidence in U.S. extended deterrence and their willingness to act in concert with the United States, right? And so the goal here might be to give U.S. allies cold feet by making these very tailored threats to impose essentially psychological pressure on our allies. Now, there's, again, pretty solid evidence that China does, in fact, have a growing arsenal of theater-range weapons, from the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile to now the new DF-27 intermediate-range/intercontinental range ballistic missile, as well as an air-launched ballistic missiles, nuclear capable of conducting precision strikes. Right. So what would China do then with this arsenal in terms of nuclear peacetime, crisis nuclear signaling? It could increase its readiness levels of its forces. It could move forces out of garrison. It could raise alert levels. It could even make public diplomatic statements about red lines around Taiwan to remind everyone that a crisis over Taiwan would fall under the nuclear shadow. This would significantly raise the stakes of any crisis and potentially create this decoupling effect where our allies would doubt U.S. extended deterrence, and in this case specifically, Japan would get cold feet, and then Japan might be more reluctant, might hem and haw, might hesitate to provide support that would be essential to U.S. responsiveness and effectiveness in dealing with a Taiwan crisis. And the Chinese these days have no problem showcasing their theater weapons. Here is a DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile undergoing an inspection, reloading, and test launching. And I think it's also important to note that there is a doctrinal basis for all of these options. We didn't pull this out of thin air. PLA manuals and PLA doctrinal publications explicitly mention the role of the blockade, the role of what's called the doctrine of disintegrating the enemy, which is another way of saying subversion, and strategic integrated deterrence, which is to maneuver China's nuclear triad in ways to demonstrate Beijing's resolve. And for the graduates, for the upcoming graduates in the audience, I know that all of you have taken the strategy and policy course. I know that all of you have a historical sensibility about this issue of strategy. So I'm going to give you a historical analogy or historical parallel to this, right? To make the case that this would not be out of character for the PLA. In fact, this would be very much in character for the CCP and the PLA to engage in these kinds of coercive actions. The case that I'm referring to is the quote-unquote peaceful liberation of Beiping, now Beijing, in early 1949 at the height of the Chinese Civil War. It's considered one of the three great campaigns of the Chinese Civil War. What did the CCP PLA do in this case? Well, first of all, in order to take the city without having to fight the garrison defending the city, they cut off key lines of communications leading Beijing to Zhangjiakou, a major regional city to the northwest, and Tianjin to its east. Essentially a kind of a blockade to prevent things from going in and out of Beiping. Secondly, they maneuvered their superior PLA forces on the outskirts of Beijing to demonstrate the futility of resistance. And importantly, they employed subversion. So the gentleman on the right on this slide, General Fu, was the garrison commander. And when the time came, the communists activated double agents, essentially his closest mentor, closest friends, even family members, to try to persuade General Fu to give up fighting. In fact, one of the best vignettes of this is that the communists activated General Fu's own daughter, who was actually groomed by the communists at a young age, joined the Communist Youth League, followed by the communists through her college years, and was actually given a job as a quote-unquote journalist in Tianjin. And when the time came, they activated her, slipped her into the city so that she could whisper to her dad about the futility of resistance. The prudent course is to give up. And the combination of a blockade, maneuvering of PLA, superior PLA forces, and subversion ultimately led General Fu to give up without a fight. And this is, to this day, Chinese strategists call this the Beiping model that could be applied to Taiwan today. So the way I think about it is that none of these individual options would be effective on their own, right? Their employment and their success in history is at best questionable. we believe that it's through the power of combinations, using these options in combination, sequencing in ways that maximize the effects of these options is what makes most sense. And so the image I have here is, if you think about what makes great tasting food, right? It's the 5 flavors, right? I forget all 5, but it's got to be salty, it's got to be sweet, it's got to have umami, right? And if you have the right balance of these 5 combinations of these 5 flavors, you get great tasting food. So in my view, a combination of these 3 coercive options and other options perhaps in play could maximize all of these dilemmas, compound these dilemmas in ways that leads to, again, apologies for my lack of AI skills, decision paralysis, right? Which is that you're creating so many dilemmas, compounding each one after the other. You throw so much sand in the gears of decision making that you lead to countries saying, allied capitals in Washington saying, well, we're not really sure what to do. And the more that the allies in the United States hem and haw, the more time that Beijing gets to squeeze Taiwan. Now, there's also another really interesting dimension here, allied dimension, okay? So you think about this as a notional trilateral coalitional partnership between the United States, Taiwan, and Japan. Each of those options that I highlighted would get each one of those players to look at the other with suspicion. So a subversion campaign against Taiwan would raise doubts in the mind of Tokyo and Washington about Taiwan's will to fight. A quarantine campaign that threw sand in the gears of Tokyo's decision-making would make the United States doubt Japan's ability to respond alongside the United States, right? And tailored nuclear coercion directed against Japan would make Japan look over its shoulder and doubt U.S. commitments, security commitments to Japan. So you can have this notional trilateral dynamic where all of the players are looking over their shoulders at each other with great suspicion and perhaps even animosity. So, is there a basis for this? Sure. Over the past few years in Taiwan, there's this thing called America skepticism theory, 美论, which basically argues, which posits that the United States would pursue its narrow national interests, and that if it came down to it, the United States would abandon Taiwan. Now, there are clearly indigenous roots to this theory, but it has also been cynically exploited by CCP political operatives to maximize the doubt in the minds of some Taiwanese. In Japan, the Japanese have been skittish ever since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine about U.S. extended deterrence, and here we have the head of the Japanese Joint Staff wondering out loud about whether the U.S. nuclear umbrella is really okay. Now, it's not just a phenomenon post-Ukraine war. Japan has always been concerned about the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, and happy to talk about the history behind that as well. So, even if those options were to fail, right, even if nuclear coercion, subversion, and quarantine were to fizzle, China still has its ultimate insurance policy, which is the PLA. In fact, you can imagine the PLA would not be the invasion option would not be off the table. In fact, you can imagine that the PLA would be mobilizing in the background as these coercive options were rolled out. And the mobilization of the PLA itself would maximize the coercive pressures of the options that I've just raised. And so if these coercive options were to fail at the outset of a crisis, China could still bring this big hammer down on Taiwan. Again, this is not a coercion or invasion, it's actually coercion and invasion. So let me conclude by just raising a couple of questions, and then we can go into Q&A. Some of the questions are, about whether we are ready to deal with a quarantine with high degree of ambiguity, whether we're able to deal with, say, nuclear brinkmanship at the outset of a crisis. Are we institutionally prepared? Are we mentally prepared to think about something like that? And are we even cognizant of scenarios in which there are options that are completely out of our control, like the complex domestic dynamics inside of Taiwan? And I think the final most important question is, are we postured and structured and ready to deal with a contingency that involves both coercion and invasion? And so, in my view, the onus is upon us, given China's growth in various tools, including the conventional military tools, that poses these multiple dilemmas on the United States and on its allies? Are we ready to deal with a wider array of contingencies and scenarios and options that China has at its disposal? So with that, I conclude my remarks, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions. Thank you.